Okay, so last time we did paragraph 5, which is on page 5, and I said that there were two things going on. Let's review one that I explained, and the other one I'll just mention because it's not clear to me how they interact with one another. We're imagining an Egyptian who lived through the period of the Jewish slavery, and he's being judged after death by the divine court, and they say to him, you punished Jews, you were a taskmaster, you imposed burdens on them, and you're going to suffer. So he says, I'm going to suffer. You, God, made the decree that they should suffer. So I just did what your decree said to do. Why are you blaming it on me? So the Rambam says God's answer to this Egyptian is going to be, I didn't make a decree that you should persecute Jews. I made a decree that Jews should be persecuted. But I didn't name you by name. And if you had decided not to persecute them, since there were 10,000 taskmasters, if you had decided not to, there would have been 999, and that's plenty for my decree to come true. So you have no excuse that I decreed it. Now we said the Egyptian is likely to answer back, but look, suppose all 10,000 had decided not to do it. What would have happened then? Then your decree wouldn't have been fulfilled. So really, your decree is what made it happen. So that's as far as we got to the objection to the Rambam. Now, way of presenting the argumentation. I suggested the following way for, so to speak, the Creator to respond to the Egyptian. I'm accusing you, I'm going to punish you for what you did in the real world. In the real world, you oppressed Jews. In the real world, there were 999 or 9,999 other ones, and if you had made the decision not to, the decree would have come true. That's what happened in the real world. You're asking about a non-real world, an imaginary world. What would have happened if things had happened differently? Somebody says, well, if water were wine, what would the world be like? I don't know, but who cares? Water isn't wine. We're living in a world where water is water. We have to deal with water as water. We have to deal with water as wine. We have to worry about that, you know. You're saying if everybody had decided not to oppress Jews, what would have happened to your decree? Okay, go hire an out-of-work philosopher and let him work on it. In the meantime, we're living in the real world, and I'm punishing you for what you did in the real world. I don't think that the Egyptian's objection is a solid objection. He's changing the subject to a general abstract discussion of God's justice. Okay, right? But that's not the subject at issue. The subject at issue is he guilty or isn't he guilty? And does the fact that God made a decree remove the guilt from him? The answer to it is no, because in the real world, any one of them could have decided not to do it, and the decree would have been carried out by the others. That's the argument that I gave last time. Is that argument clear? Yeah. Okay, now, the other thing in the vocabulary of the Rambam here is that he goes back and forth between saying it was a decree versus saying it was a prediction. At one point he says, suppose somebody told you that in the future there will be good people and bad people. Could a bad person say, ha, you said there'll be bad people, so I'm not really bad and you can't punish me? Oh, no one would say that, because I'm informing you of the way of the world, that there are good people and bad people. Just like he quotes the verse in Deuteronomy, that there will always be poor people in the land. That doesn't mean God made them poor. Doesn't mean they should decreed to be poor. It means that's the way economies work, that there are rich people and poor people, and that's why there are rules that we have for dealing with those who have money and those who don't have money. So if you switch from decree to just a prediction, then it seems that you wouldn't need the argument, I didn't make it for any particular person, right? Because let's suppose it had been made for a particular person. And in the future, Reuben Schwartz is the one who's going to do this. Not because God has decreed, just informing you that that's the fact. That's what's going to happen. If it's only informing what will happen, not a decree, so then, maybe I'm getting the answer now. I've only been through this 40 or 50 times. If it's only a prediction of what's going to happen, and it's not a decree, then how could you use that as an excuse? See, I'm not really guilty because God predicted it. So what? Okay. But then you'd want to know, how did God predict it? How did he make the prediction? Now we're back to the two solutions, or two ways of handling foreknowledge and free will. If you take the way which is not Maimonides' way, you act, God observes you acting, and therefore he gets his knowledge as to what you do, and then there's no problem, how could I have done something else? Because if I had done something else, he would have known something else. If that's the way you look at it, then indeed, he could predict, and he has no hand whatsoever in making it happen, nor any hand in stopping anything else from happening, and it would just be a prediction. But Maimonides doesn't allow that solution. It doesn't allow that solution. Maybe my problem was I was building in the other solution, which Maimonides doesn't use. This is Maimonides' text, after all, we're trying to understand. So here, it may be that making the prediction is equivalent to a decree, because there's no way of just assigning it to divine knowledge. We don't credit God with knowledge. Okay, that's a speculation. I haven't worked it out. I'm just reporting that my mind is still active, still thinking about things. At any rate, the Rambam here has a way of disposing of the problem. I think that it's adequate. So in this chapter, he has defended his principle of free will against various attacks on the basis of the text of the Tanakh. Some saying that God makes people do things, and his answer to that is, yes, there are such things, but they're very, very rare, and they're defined specifically by circumstances that are well described, and therefore they're not going to apply to the vast, vast majority of normal people's lives. And though he tolerates those exceptions, and has explained them. I apologize. I should have printed up chapter 7, but I got 4 hours sleep last night, like most of you, so I forgot to do it. So I'll just start by reading chapter 7 in here. This chapter has a lot of musar in it. How a person should look at life, given the fact that he has free will. Seeing that free will is given to a person, as we've explained, a person should try to do teshuva and wake up to try to, I guess it means to use your mouth to rid yourself of your transgression, so that he should die about teshuva, so that he will merit life in the world to come. Now, we did say, and I didn't stress it at the time, the Rambam says the divine system of justice is such that certain crimes should be punished in this world, certain crimes should be punished in the next world, and some should be punished in both. And then we said teshuva stops all punishment. There's no punishment after teshuva. That means that two things. It means that if suffering is necessary for the cleansing process, it's only cleansing process, not punishment. And number two, it means the person leaves the world clean. 100% clean. If he does teshuva for things that are wrong, he leaves the world 100% clean. What is punishment in the next world? What is that? The only thing that the Rambam mentions explicitly is annihilation. We talked about this last week, how annihilation could be compatible with loving kindness as the purpose for the creation of the world. But it just means a person ceases to exist. It doesn't merit to continue to exist after physical death. Now, for the Rambam, what would have survived physical death is what we call the soul. The Rambam, the body doesn't survive. Even after resurrection, there has to be death. Because what goes into the world to come is only the soul, without the body. And that means the soul ceases to exist. So that's why he says here, when you do tshuva, the outcome, the difference in outcome is it removes the responsibility for certain types of transgressions and rehabilitates a person's record to the point where he can merit life in the world to come. That's the as we say in Hebrew, lashon nafkamina. Now he gives a piece of natural advice. A person should always look at himself as if he's close to death. And maybe he'll die very soon. And right now, he's still subject to his transgression. So what is he going to do? If we die, people who get from medical authorities, you have 2 months to live, that changes their life a lot. Because they say I have a lot to finish up before I go. So one of the things you finish up is cleaning off your slate. Therefore, he should do tshuva for his transgression immediately, and don't say when I get old, then I'll do tshuva, because maybe he won't get old. He won't live that long. And he quotes a verse from Proverbs. Your garments should always be white, and the oil on your head should not be lacking. Now, the opposite of white garments is not, purple garments or rainbow-colored garments. The opposite is stained garments, garments that are stained with your transgressions. So clean your garments. And anointing your head is what you do is a matter of almost luxury, and it shows a certain distinction. So you should prepare yourself in that way. There's a Mishnah, by the way, in Pirkei Avos, where it says, do tshuva one day before you die. Oh, you don't know when you're going to die? You might die today, so do tshuva today. Right, don't put it off. And now the Rambam says, a person shouldn't say, well, let's see, tshuva. How does tshuva help? And what does it help for? Well, maybe tshuva only applies to transgressions that have a physical action in expression, like forbidden sexual relations or robbery or theft, which is different in Hebrew. Robbery means brutally depriving the person of his property in front of his face. The verse is snatching the sword out of the hand of the holder. And theft is sneaking in the middle of the night when he's not home. Just like a person has to do tshuva from these transgressions, as you understand very well, so too he has to examine his character, his bad character traits, and to do tshuva from them, from anger, from hatred, from jealousy, from competition, from mockery, from being overly ambitious and dependent upon making money. I used to think about Bill Gates when he had $20 billion. Why did he get out of bed in the morning? $20 billion. And then he had 30. And then he had 40. And then he had 50. And then he had $60 billion. What does he want? More zeros on his bank account? What can he do with $60 billion? And then he woke up and started to give charity. And he gave it in recent year more charity than anybody else in the history of the world. Because you can't make a life out of making money. But a lot of people don't know that. They take it as a competition. Musk became the second richest man in the world for a little while, a few months this year. And now he might be the richest man in the world. So suppose you were 13th. Would that really be bad? Would you feel terrible about being the 13th richest man in the world? I mean, what kind of life is that? So he says, to wake up from that kind of terrible, distorted set of priorities, and honor, and chasing after physical pleasures and similar things. A person has to do tshuva from all of those things, meaning you're responsible for your character as well as your actions. Now, this is a subject which, once upon a time, was, I would say, addressed with reasonable attention in philosophy, and it seems to have fallen out of style largely, if not completely, in the last 50 or so years. That's the subject of virtue. When's the last time you heard a discussion of virtue? I'll bet you've never heard a discussion of virtue. You heard a lot about justice. You heard a lot about victimhood. You heard a lot about theft, about ancestral lands and oppression of the poor and so forth and so on. But virtue? Well, you see, the perspective is social. What are you doing to other people? Now, what you do to other people is obviously morally very important. I'm not downgrading that subject. But in addition, there was the idea of being a virtuous person. And someone whose actions vis-a-vis others are perfect and isn't a virtuous person, we don't regard as a moral success. I'll give you an example. Meet my continuous example, George. George has sticky fingers. He steals. That's what George does. I've talked to George. I've tried to convince him that this isn't a good idea. And he tolerates me, but he doesn't change. So now I happen to know that George is going to Beijing on business. And I say to him, George, listen, the Chinese have laws not like what we do. If they catch you stealing, they chop off your arm. So I'm recommending, and they have plainclothes policemen everywhere, and they have cameras everywhere. So I'm recommending to you, George, when you're in Beijing, don't do it. Well, for some unaccountable reason, he takes me seriously, and he says, okay, thanks for pointing it out. You know, I'm taking your advice. And he goes to Beijing, and he spends 6 months there negotiating his business deal, and drops dead. Has George become a moral success now that he stopped stealing? I don't think so. He doesn't admit stealing is wrong. He doesn't think there's any crime in stealing. He just doesn't want to get caught. He doesn't want to have his arm chopped off. That's not a moral success. A moral success is someone who does what's right because it's right, not because he's going to lose otherwise. If he's only motivated by the fact he's going to lose, he's no different from an animal. You train animals with pleasure and pain. They come to expect pleasure if they do this, pain if they do that, and that's how they behave. So, moral success includes being virtuous. Being virtuous means having good character. So what the Rambam says, and by the way, according to his codification of 613 commandments, one of the biblical commandments is to have good moral character. And that means that you have control over that. That you can make yourself into a morally good person in terms of virtue, not just in terms of action. And I think this is realistic. Of course, you can't just snap your fingers and decide to be virtuous, but there are many programs for improving your behavior and your character. Sorry, we're talking about character now. Improving your character. For example, developing sensitivity for other people. If you're not a psychopath, if you're capable of feeling other people's pain, but you've lived a sheltered existence where you've never been in contact with people who really suffer, exposing yourself to that contact can change your character. You can develop sympathy for other people. You can develop caring for other people. Because, and you don't have to actually go in person, you can do it through literature. One of the great values of literature is that it provides you with vicarious experience so that you can come to appreciate the lives of others and be able to relate to them in a more sensitive way. By the way, in some cases, this is, I would say, the only way out. You don't want to be able to empathize with addicts by becoming an addict. I don't recommend that. I think reading good biographies of addicts would be a much better plan to do that. Yeah.
So, touching on this idea of like virtue as well as, money, and you mentioned being the richest person as a priority. Do you think there's ever like certain priorities or values that cannot be overcome just through thought, but rather one needs to experience it?
My suggestion in the last 3 minutes or so is that overcoming it through thought is probably not practical all across the board. You can overcome it through behavior, but not through thought. There's a book called Sefer HaChinuch, what's translated into English under the title The Book of Education, which goes through all 613 commandments and explains reasons for them, all of them. If you were taught that some mitzvahs don't have reasons, cancel that. There's a theme. There are several themes, but one theme that rides throughout the book is nif'al l'fi pu'ulosav. A person is acted on by his actions. This is another way of putting what I said 8 minutes ago. We look at an action and we tend to evaluate it on the basis of its external consequences. And we forget that the action has internal consequences also. It's not only that you act on other people in a certain way, but you reinforce certain aspects of yourself, or you degrade or down, you reduce the strength of certain aspects of yourself. And when you decide what to do, you should have both of them in mind. There is a Hasidic, I don't know if it's a real story, it's a parable. The parable goes like this. A man came into a Hasidic Rabbi and he said, I was dying, and I made a vow that if I survive, I'll give 400 rubles to charity, and I survived. Here are the 400 rubles, and he puts them on the desk. And he goes out. Next guy comes in and he says, Rabbi, I'm going to have to marry off my daughter, and they're asking for my contribution to the wedding expenses, and they're asking for 400 rubles. I need help. So the Rabbi says to himself, he gave me 400, and the next guy needs exactly 400. That's not an accident. He gives him the 400. 2 minutes later, he calls his gabbai, his private secretary, and says, go out, find that guy, bring him back. Brings him back, put the money on the table. Puts the money on the table. Go outside and wait. He goes outside and wait. 2 hours later, he calls him back in and says, take the money and marry off your daughter. Fine, he goes. Now, if you're a private secretary to a Rebbe, you have privileges. You could say, he says to him, what happened? You gave it to him. You called him back. Put it on the table for 2 hours. Then you gave it to him again. What happened? So this is what the Rebbe said. Listen carefully. He said, I gave the money to him, and then I thought, wait a second. 400 rubles to one person? I could make 20 packages of 20 and give to 20 different people. And if you believe that money has marginal utility, so that smaller packages to poor people has more value than it, okay, you can become an economist about it. So then he had this second thought. Maybe I shouldn't give 400 to one person. Maybe I should give 20 to 20, right? And then he said, and then I realized that one of these thoughts was coming from the good inclination, and the other was coming from the evil inclination. And I had to figure out which was which. Now at this point, the reader says, hey, wait a second. Both thoughts are to give it away. Neither thought is to buy a palace with it or invest it in AT&T. So why is one good and one bad? But that's how he understood it. That one's coming from the good, one's coming from the bad, and he had to figure out which is which. That's what he tells the private secretary. So the private secretary says, so what's the punchline? How did you figure out it was better to give it to him than give it to the 20 to 20? And he said, because the second thought came to me like this. Don't give 400 to one person. Don't do that. Don't give 400 to one person. Give 20 to 20. Any thought whose root is in don't give is a bad thought. He analyzed the psychology. Where's this coming from in me? Now, what will the external consequences be? Again, I'm not discarding external consequences. I'm only an anti-utilitarian where the utilitarianism pretends to be the whole picture. No one's against taking utility as an important moral consideration. It's just that it can't be the whole story because it's just too dumb. He's saying, I'm going to reinforce a part of me which is holding back. I don't want to reinforce that part. The Rambam asked the following question. You have a certain amount of money to give to charity each month. Let's say it's $100. How should you give it? Some person with a terrible story of his poverty, give him the whole $100, or divide it up into $10 packets or $1 packets and give out to many people. Both ways $100 is going. He says, other things being equal, the latter way is better because when you give 100 to one, the rest of the month you say no. So you're getting used to saying no, which means if you're afraid of cognitive dissonance, that you avoid sympathizing with them, you don't want to feel their pain. That's not good for your character. Similarly, there's a story that someone, this is in Europe, let's say 150 years ago, went to the Chafetz Chaim. He was offered a job in a bank, and he wanted to know whether he should take it or not. Now, their circumstances at the bank were different from ours. This is what the Chafetz Chaim told him. If you are the employee who receives deposits, don't take it. If you're the one who pays out withdrawals, do take it. Why? After all, it's all the bank's money. Yeah, it is all the bank's money. But if you receive deposits, you're taking in money all day long. People are giving you money all day long. And all day long, you're taking money, you're putting it in the drawer. And if you're paying out withdrawals, you're giving out money all day long. That's not zero. that will have an effect on your character. So there's a whole study. Number one, what features of character are desirable, which isn't trivial at all, and then how to deal with that. How do you develop different features of character? Now, as we've gotten this far, let me illustrate this idea that what features of character isn't trivial. And here, you have to be very, very careful of a standard mistake of allowing people who are, or at least claim to be, experts in one area to talk about another area. Be very, very careful about that. When I taught at Hopkins, there was a fellow there in the physics department who discovered a particle. Those days, there were lots of particles to be discovered. You know, the more energy you put in, the more particles you discover. He discovered one. It was a big news. So the student newspaper interviewed him for his views on religion. I'm glad you're laughing. They put up the interview on the philosophy bulletin board with a sign underneath. See how many mistakes you can find in this. Why would you interview a physicist about religion? Why would you do that? You wouldn't interview about backyard cooking, would you? No. So why would you expect to? No, they're so smart. And they're so objective and they're so clever. I guess what he says about religion, you know. Okay, so here's one a little closer to home. What is maturity? What is maturity?
I guess we're the wrong people to ask by the same logic.
I'm sorry?
Surely we'd be the wrong people to ask, no?
I'm not sure about that, but I'm talking now from the secular point of view for the moment, right? So it is widespread, perhaps universal, in psychology, including child development psychology, and in sociology, that maturity is autonomy. The individual defines himself in his individuality, and it's individuality that determines what he is, what's important, what his priorities are, and so forth and so on. That's why in political philosophy, you have, in the British philosophers, the idea of the implicit contract. A society is made out of people who implicitly contract with one another for certain mutual responsibilities and obligations. Because without contracting, there's nothing. Essentially, you're just a single blade of grass. That's all. Really. And then this applies to shame and guilt. Shame is a sense of your interaction with other people. You're ashamed before others. Guilt is what you feel about your own failures in the privacy of your own conscience. Now it comes out that guilt characterizes maturity because it's autonomous, and shame characterizes a primitive sociological condition or an immature condition for a human being, and the desirable development is to develop from shame to guilt. Okay? First of all, let me ask you a question. Is maturity good or bad? Good. It's good, right? So if you define maturity as autonomy, then you're saying it's good, aren't you? Now, who are you to say it's good? You're a psychologist? That qualifies you to make moral judgments? Excuse me, I don't think that was in your training. I won't say that you're incapable of making moral judgments. Some people would, but I won't say that. But surely you're not an expert in moral judgments. And yet you get to define what maturity is? That's not obviously the right thing to do. And in particular, with this wave of the psychological wand, poor Aristotle is ruled out of court. Because Aristotle said that people are social by their very nature. There's no such thing as an individual human being without his connections to the rest of society. He's not human. Part of essential human nature is a relationship to other people and to structures in society. And because you're talking psychology, you have the right to rule out one of the world's greatest philosophers in the history of the world. I don't think that's right either. So when you talk about virtue, what goals there are for virtue is one question, and number two, the techniques that are necessary for achieving those goals is also necessary. The Rambam describes both in Hilchos Deos, he does it in some detail, and what the Rambam is saying here is, don't think that Teshuva only applies to mistaken actions. Teshuva applies to bad character traits as well, because you have a certain amount of control over them by undertaking certain courses of action, study, and experience, which can help strengthen some parts of your character and weaken other parts, and thereby improve your character. Okay? And he says, if I compare transgressions that involve overt action versus transgressions which are a matter of character, there's a certain difficulty because an action is something which is a physical performance, and you have much more control over your physical performance than you do over your character. And it's very difficult to change your character traits, but still, that is something that you have a responsibility to do. Now, this chapter's general philosophy about Teshuva. Listen to these words. A person should not imagine about Teshuva that he is distant from the level of the righteous because of the transgressions and sins that he has committed. We're talking about a person after he's done Teshuva, but he says, look at my history. Look at my history. I can't compare myself to a tzaddik, the person who never did these terrible things. Okay, I worked on a repair, but still, I'm a repaired person, and he never got broken. That's not true. But he is beloved, and he's beloved by God, and God cherishes him as if he never sinned. Number one. In other words, he's succeeded in cleansing himself so that there's no liability in terms of his past history. And not only that, but his reward is very great because he tasted the taste of sin and he disconnected himself from it. And he conquered his evil inclination. The sages said, this is in the Talmud, Mokum Shabali Tshuva Omdim, the place where a person who's done tshuva stands, people who are perfectly righteous cannot stand there. That is to say, their position, their status of the person who does tshuva is greater than the status of those who never sinned in the world, because the ones who sinned are conquering their spirits more than the ones who never sinned. Well, that's certainly very encouraging. What the Rambam doesn't mention, and I think it should be used to put this statement in perspective, is that this quotation from the Talmud is one out of two views. And on the very same page, there's a view of Rabbi Yabo, which is the opposite. He says the place where a tzaddik who never sinned stands, a person that tshuva cannot stand. So it's the exact opposite. Okay, the Rambam chose to bring this one, and he chose it to explain how about tshuva should look at himself. It's not obviously disagrees with the other one, and it's not obvious how to understand the disagreement. What's the disagreement in the Gemara? The best answer that I received when I was living in Baltimore, and there was a rabbi, I think his name was Feldman, at the German shul there. I heard a few shiurim from him. He happened to be a Chabad chassid. And he said, the Rambam's description here is based on an assumption. He says he tasted the taste of the transgression, and now he has to conquer his evil inclination, which wants him to repeat the transgression. Oy, the bacon cheeseburgers. Okay, I gave them up. But, and this week there's a 2-for-1 sale at McDonald's. No, but I'm not doing that. And the tzaddik says, bacon cheeseburger? Are you nuts? Are you out of your mind? I wouldn't be able to stomach it. So obviously, I'm working harder than he is. I'm struggling to conquer my Yetzer Hara for that forbidden pleasure. Said Rabbi Feldman, that presumes that the experience of the transgression was sweet, was pleasant, and still attractive to you. Not always is that so. When people become Baalei Teshuva, I think, often share the opposite experience. A life like that is a life that's meaningless, it's low, it has nothing about it that I can respect in myself. So the clever psychologists say, don't live for respect, just enjoy. Aren't they clever? And people who become Baalei Teshuva at the top of their game, they're making a lot of money, they have a lot of fame, and there are many people like that, and they think, is that all? Is this what life is all about? There's nothing else? So that caused them to doubt the value of their success. They've got it. They've got it made. And somehow, for them, it doesn't make it for them. So that means that in this type of Baal Teshuva, he's running away from something. He's running away from what the French call ennui, angst, the sense of meaninglessness and despair of a life that hasn't got any higher value, higher focus, higher aim. And therefore, when he becomes a tzaddik, it's not just out of love and appreciation for what Torah is and the truth of the Torah and the greatness of relationship with the Creator. No, it's to avoid that also. That means his motivation isn't purely attractiveness of Torah, attracted to Torah. It's also running away from the opposite. He could be worse than a tzaddik, because part of his motivation for not eating cheeseburgers is the self-disgust that he felt with himself in eating cheeseburgers. There, the motivation would be the opposite. This could be what Rabbi Abba was talking about, which would mean that it would be a division of the population. Wouldn't necessarily mean that they oppose one another, different types. The Rambam is stressing this one here. And I think that when we are realistic about ourselves, many of us come with a certain sense of that negative motivation. You know, the Rambam and others write that your motivation, if we get to the 10th chapter, we'll see it. Motivation for doing a mitzvah should not be for the world to come, not for reward at all, because it's right, something like that. We'll get to that. So I know some Bali Teshuva will say, gee, the Rambam writes about that at such a big madrega, such a high level. I never think about reward. I'm not doing this for reward. I'm doing this because it's right, because it's good, because it's the thing that needs to be done. And he thinks to himself, boy, I skipped over all that hard work, and I'm already at the end. So I think it's the Kochav Yitzchak, so Salanter, who says, and Rav Dessa says this word for word, you haven't begun the journey because you don't know what Olam Haba is. The one who does it for its own sake without reward is the one person who realizes what reward is, understands that it's the most precious thing in terms of his own selfish interests, wants it desperately, and turns his back on it. You've never heard of it. You've never confronted it. No clue what it is. You don't qualify for that. But then the question is, if it isn't reward that's driving me, what's driving me? Where's the motivation coming from? Here's an explanation. It's coming from the degradation of the alternative. So that being the case, what the Rambam is writing about here is half the story for a certain group of people. Now he's talking about tshuva. So, and by the way, the word about tshuva in the Rambam and the texts up until I'd say the 20th century or maybe the end of the 19th century is a person who is religious and believes in the Torah and keeps the commandments and falls in one area. One thing that drags him down. It may drag him down once, or he may get into a bad habit, and he comes back. We're not talking about people like us who grew up in non-religious homes and then decided at a mature age of 21, is that not an oxymoron? Maybe. Or 23 or 25 to become religious. We call ourselves Bali Teshuva. That's an extension of the classical term. Classical term is a person who made a mistake. When he did it, he knew it was wrong. He felt guilty, but felt guilty about doing it. And it took him time to overcome it. That's the classical about Teshuva. Yeah.
So we're saying also that the struggle is an ingredient that somehow gives like strength to the expressions of Avat Hashem, like it gives like reinforcement to
struggle is a very important ingredient. In fact, in terms of reward, which is what the Rambam is talking about here, the Talmud says the reward is according to the struggle. Because the deep point here is that all you have is the struggle. Success is something which is a divine gift. You don't make it happen. You struggle, because Baruch Hu decides whether you should have the result or shouldn't have the result. You can't get credit for the fact. It wouldn't be fair for God to say, I'm giving you a gift and I'll give you a reward for having the gift. That's nonsensical. You only get reward for something that you did, that you made, that you had control over. So the struggle is crucial. In the way of God by Lutzato, he says 3 times, all reward is according to the effort that you put in. That's all. And because you have nothing else. Yeah.
What if you feel like you're just
struggling, and you don't feel like you're obtaining a reward.
Oh, well, there's nothing in our literature which says you'll feel that you're getting a reward. You are promised that you will get a reward. It's sort of like waiting for your paycheck, right? 3 weeks into the month, you don't feel the money coming in. You just know that in a week you're going to get a check, right? And that should give you the satisfaction that you're working for something. I'd say very rarely. Now, sometimes you will have a feeling of closeness to a Kodesh Baruch Hu. And in a certain sense, closeness to a Kodesh Baruch Hu is the ultimate reward altogether. That can happen, but it's not that it must happen. You know, sometimes the analogy of how a Kodesh Baruch Hu runs the world, the analogy of a king. A king has many servants doing many jobs. The prime minister sees them every day. The general comes and gets orders and goes out for 6 months, and the foot soldier never goes to see the king. But they're all following the king's orders. They're all participating in the success, and they'll all be rewarded for their participation. Different people are in different conditions. Yeah.
So just to clarify on your point, so my understanding is that like a tzaddik cannot sin, like purposefully. Is that true?
No. You're thinking of the status of Adam before he ate from the tree of knowledge. That's said about him. Oh, I'm sorry. That's one thing. There is in the Tanya. Yes, the Tanya is someone who is beyond free will, and he doesn't have the capacity to do anything wrong. According to the Tanya, the Benoni, who's what we would call, say, mediocre, so to speak, never sins because he always wins every battle. I don't know if in English we would use that terminology, but that's what he says. And the Rasha is someone who loses sometimes. That's a unique terminology. Maybe there are others, but it's not a common terminology to use. The Meshech Chochmah speaks about the same idea in his introduction to the book of Exodus. I recommend it to those who think that the Tanya's idea is unique. It isn't unique at all. And he bases it on a Rambam. And the Mesilas Yesharim talks about, in the last chapter, people becoming equal to angels. So it's not a unique idea, and one shouldn't put it in the basket of where you put Hasidic ideas, how you label that basket, depending upon your prejudices. It's an idea but the vast majority regard a tzaddik as a person who struggles and who wins the battles. And what the Rambam is saying here is that the tzaddik has less of a struggle than the Baal Teshuva, because the Baal Teshuva is struggling with not eating cheeseburgers, and the tzaddik is not struggling with not eating cheeseburgers. But that doesn't mean he's not struggling, and that doesn't mean that he can't make a mistake. In this work of the Hilchos Teshuva, the Rambam divides the tzaddik as someone whose balance of good and evil is 50% plus 1, just over the 50% line. That's called a tzaddik, and a Rasha is 50% minus 1. Notice I didn't say 51%, 49%. Think about that. That's wrong. It's 50% plus 1. That's over the 50. Okay, never mind. That's just mathematics. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the best way is for someone to be doing everything, but not for the reward, right?
Yes.
So what should our base of mind? What should our real?
Oh, that's a very good point. That's a very important point. That's a very, very high level. He says that Abraham achieved that level, but many great scholars don't achieve it consistently. For us, that would be something to hope to achieve 2 or 3 times in a lifetime, or to achieve it by degree, to a certain extent, to work in that direction. HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised reward and punishment. He didn't do that as a stumbling block and to say, ha, you did it every time, you're going to get a clap here because you only did it for reward and punishment. No, that is a kosher motivation. A person who does it because he says, the Creator offered me a reward for doing this, is doing His will on the basis of a motivation that the Creator provided, and he will get credit for the commandments that he performed. It's just that he should try to graduate to a higher level where he can do it without that. And I think it varies from mitzvah to mitzvah. Some are easier to do that way, some are harder to do that way, right? I would imagine if you saw a child drowning and you made an effort to save the child, you probably wouldn't be thinking, I wonder how many brownie points I'm getting for this. I wonder how many ice cream cones are going to give me for this. The child is drowning, so you have to save his life. There, the the tragedy, the potential tragedy is what grips you. And there you're not thinking about yourself at all. So it is possible to happen. There's a question of making it consistent and not being stimulated by that kind of emotional reaction, working on your character to the point where that... I wouldn't say that you should judge yourself as a failure if you don't, and you should be working in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah, just to confirm, so that the best point would be is doing it not for the reward, but just because it's a good thing to do.
Okay, I used that vocabulary and I qualified it immediately. The Rambam's words in the 10th chapter are Osa emes b'fnei shehu emes, which you could translate literally as he does the emes because it's emes. The only problem is that you look at the dictionary as the emes means truth, and it doesn't. Emes does not mean truth, and it doesn't mean true. It means something else, which overlaps with truth in certain cases, but it means really something else. Rav Dessler has a whole essay on that, and when we get there, I'll talk about it in Yud Hashem, or it's online. I mean, I've recorded this. So there's a very deep idea over there, which I can't go into now. It's just there's too much to it. Yeah, there was another hand up. Did I miss it? Okay. So that's that's the end of Halacha Daled. Okay, we only have 1 minute. Okay, we'll start with Halacha Hey tomorrow, and in Yud Hashem I'll print it out for you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay, Baruch Tiyeh.